A good morning to those dialing in from the US. A good evening to all those joining us from overseas. On behalf of USISPF, the US India Strategic Partnership Forum, and FMC, an association of former members of Congress, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this timely discussion focusing on the outlook for the US India bilateral relationship. We're excited to bring you such a distinguished panel to cover this topic and are fortunate to have Ambassador Miriam Sapiro, a former deputy U.S. trade representative with over 25 years of public and private sector expertise at the helm to guide us through this discussion. With that, Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Patrick. And I'm delighted to welcome everyone on behalf of the forum and the association. I'm Miriam Sapiro, as Patrick mentioned, a managing director at Sard Verbinnen, where I co-lead our Washington, D.C. office and focus on helping companies and organizations through crises and communications challenges, whether it's issues relating to trade and investment or M&A, restructuring, cyber, litigation support, among other issues. And I've had the privilege of working at the State Department and the National Security Council over the years, as well as at USTR as Deputy and Acting U.S. Trade Representative. Our topic today and this panel almost needs no introduction. And I say that because with a rather important election coming up in the United States, and both this country and much of the world facing a health pandemic and an economic crisis, this is a critical time to assess the US-India relationship, both its challenges and its opportunities. As our esteemed ambassador to India, Ken Juster, said recently, the US-India relationship is nearly as old as the United States, and commerce has played a special role in it since the beginning. And today, more than 220 years later, our countries are continuing to grow closer and closer. More than 4 million Indian Americans live in the United States and contribute to every facet of American life. And as we all know, US goods and services to India totaled over $140 billion in 2018, which is the last year we have solid data for. But at the same time, the goods and services trade deficit that we have with India was over $25 billion. So today we have a stellar panel to speak frankly about what we can do to address both of these numbers. Before I introduce them, a couple Zoom housekeeping matters. First of all, as Patrick mentioned, we will be taking questions from the audience. So anyone with a question, please feel free to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to pose a question. These questions will be collected and we will get to as many as we possibly can during the second part of our conversation. In submitting your question, please do include your affiliation. And if your question is for a specific panelist, please feel free to note that. Let me now briefly introduce each of our distinguished panelists, and then I'll ask them each to offer some thoughts on the current state of the US-India relationship. We're going to start with Congressman Bera, then we'll move to Becca Gould, and then we'll move to Congressman George Holding. Congressman Bera has represented California's 7th Congressional District near Sacramento in the House since 2013. He is currently a member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, where he serves as chairman of the Subcommittee on Asia, the Pacific, and Nonproliferation. He's also vice chair of the House Committee on Science, Space, and Technology, and the longest serving Indian American in Congress. And his training as a doctor could not be more timely in terms of helping Congress and our country grapple with the consequences of COVID-19. Congressman George Holding is the co-chair of the Congressional Caucus on India and Indian Americans. He represents North Carolina's 2nd Congressional District now and serves on the House Ways and Means Committee, the Budget Committee, and the Ethics Committee. He practiced law before serving as United States Attorney for North Carolina. So we have a lawyer and a doctor on this panel. I think my mother would be very, very proud. We're also joined by Becca Gould, Senior Vice President at American Tower, a role she has held since 2014. Prior to joining American Tower, over the course of 12 years, Becca built and managed Dell's Government Affairs Office, which is when I first met her. Prior to that, she worked as a vice president at the Business Software Alliance, and also as counsel to the House Energy and Commerce Committee and before that in private practice at a law firm. So we actually have 2 lawyers and a doctor, or 3 lawyers if you count me as well. And each of them, when they speak, may share something with us that we can't otherwise glean from their biographies. So let me turn the mic over to Ami first, and then Becca, and then George for the last word before we go to Q&A. Ami, you're up.
Well, thanks, Ambassador, for that generous introduction. George, in addition to being my colleagues, a good friend, and we actually were in India in late February before everything shut down, about a week before President Trump's trip out there. And there was real anticipation that we might be penning a trade deal, at least the beginnings of a trade deal. And it's always that elusive trade deal that seems one step away from where we need to go. But the fact that the conversation has continued in the midst of the pandemic, I think is a good sign. And instead of thinking big, let's just get that first step out of the way and build off of that first step. And I did a panel with Minister Gould last week, and again, I think there's a sense of optimism that we can get there. I also think the opportunities in the midst of this global pandemic for the United States and India to work together are huge. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the supply chain issues that the pandemic's really exposed. But as we've had our conversations with the Indians. And it's not just the US, it's Australia, the European Union, and others that realize we have to build redundancy in our healthcare supply chain. And India does have a mature pharmaceutical sector. They do have a very mature vaccine manufacturing sector. And as we look at global vaccine development, manufacturing, distribution, I think India does have a very critical role to play, and there are real opportunities there. As we look at, a company from my home state of California, Gilead, is already doing tremendous work in India around remdesivir, clinical trials, et cetera. So I do think this is a time for the United States and India to step up, partner together, not to just solve our own unique challenges with the pandemic. Both countries obviously have been hit hard by a high number of cases, but also to partner to care for the rest of the world. And again, I'll use the context of vaccine delivery, because until we vaccinate 6 to 7 billion people around the world, we won't have defeated the virus. And India is going to play a critical role in that, as well as the United States. So I'll turn it back over to you, Ambassador.
Thank you so much. If I could just pose one question, because what you said was so interesting. And I was going to ask you about how COVID-19 has changed the direction of our trade partnership, if at all. With members of Congress pushing for legislation and the administration obviously wanting to do more onshoring of PPE and pharmaceutical manufacturing, you and Congressman Holding may see India within the family and part of that effort, but others may think more in terms of the United States, and we have to bring more domestic manufacturing capabilities back. So with that in mind, how will this affect our relationship with India?
I don't think it'll be either or. I do think there'll be a push to do some onshoring, but the truth of it is a lot of the low margin raw ingredients that go into pharmaceuticals, into vaccines, even India relies on a lot of those APIs coming in from China. And I think there is that opportunity while we onshore to also think about how we build redundancy. So we're not so dependent on a single country, in this case, China, for our supply chain. And in my conversations with Australians, the Europeans, et cetera, everyone's thinking in that context of redundancy. And again, I think this is a great place where India already has some of that infrastructure that can help us build redundancy.
Well, that's great. Well, I like and share your optimism. Over to Becca now for some opening remarks, please.
Sure. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the FMC and USISPF for hosting this, and you, Ambassador, for kicking this off. And also to both congressmen who I've worked very closely with on the US-India relationship in the past, 5, 6, 7 years. So as we continue to go forward, we're sharing a lot of forums together. Just quickly, who is American Tower? American Tower is a real estate company. You can actually see some of our real estate in the background behind me. We own the towers, and it's like an apartment building. So AT&T, Verizon, Bharti Airtel rent space from us, and you can see their antennas on our towers. We have 180,000 of these globally, 75,000 in India. I would be remiss if I didn't say that while we're headquartered in Boston, Massachusetts, our other principal location in the United States is in Congressman Holdings' district. And he has been a great colleague of ours, both in the US as well as we go forward in India. We have 40,000 towers in the US. We also were privileged by President Obama and Secretary Pritzker appointing my CEO to the US-India CEO Forum, and then Secretary Russ asked us to chair that forum over the course of the last few years. That's 20 CEOs from the US side and 20 from the Indian side. And I would just say that it's been quite an interesting, was quite an interesting 18 months, because we had the US government shutdown, we had the Indian elections, and now we have COVID. But I will say how important these dialogues and these forums are, because the companies continued their dialogues throughout this, which I think kept things flowing, kept trade going, as Congressman Bera said, she's been very critical, and I have some examples of that. And then just very specifically for my company in connectivity, you are probably all connected through one of our real estates, whether you're properties, one of our towers, whether you're in India or whether you're here. Right before this pandemic, we did a government to government best practice sharing with India. Folks from the State Department, FCC, NTIA flew to three cities in India to help share best practices on connectivity. I think those dialogues and continuing that going forward is how we're all connected here today, and it's very critical.
Thank you, Becca. I wanted to ask you, because American Tower focuses a bit less on what we call traditional trade disputes with India in terms of tariff and especially tariff barriers, but even to some extent non-tariff barriers. If you put on the hat of an honest broker, so think of yourselves as the Switzerland of this area, where do you think India needs to give more? And are there any areas where the US may be asking too much in this effort to try to finally reach even what we call a mini trade agreement, let alone maybe down the road, a more comprehensive deal?
Well, first I would start by stressing the commonalities and why I think the dialogue continues to go forward. I mean, these are two big democracies who share values, and I think that cannot be overstated to the importance of that in our shared, as we move into the trade dialogue. You're right, we're real estate. So when we go into a country, we are there to stay, and we don't trade as much as we're invested locally. So I think that is why we've been looked to help in these trade discussions. Specifically to your question, what could each side do a little bit more? I think that continuing the dialogue and coming from an industry point of view, Jim Taiclet, my former CEO, and Tom Bartlett, my current CEO, have both said, what can companies do in addition to their offerings? And I will say that's what we have been very, very focused on, is continuing the dialogue and continuing the trade functions going forward. So I'll just give you one quick example. When COVID hit, there were some discussions about some of the medicines that are going to be used to address COVID, which are currently being tested, were coming from India. And there was a big concern that the export from India to the US would either be mitigated or even turned off. Through some of these forums and through the US ISPF, the dialogue kept going. And therefore, we have been able to get those medications into the US. So I think those are critical, what you might call mini deals, that maybe are not getting as much publicity or front page news, but are going on every day.
Mm-hmm. If I could just follow up, what are some of the challenges that American Tower has faced or is now facing in the Indian market?
Sure. So transparency is always a challenge, no matter where we are. But the issues we face are not unlike those we face globally. A lot of the issues are zoning and best practices, and they're very local issues. And that's where these best practice sessions have really come into play, is when there's best practices out of India and there's best practices out of the US. And when governments get together and share those best practices, it helps us lay the foundation for the communication we're all using today more quickly.
Good, that's great. And we'll continue to take the optimism. Let me now turn to George for the last word before we turn to some broader Q&A.
Great. Well, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's always a delight to talk about India. And it's a delight to be on with Ami and Becca. We've all been to India together, different times. And of course, Ami is not only a rock star here in Congress, but he's a rock star in India. So it's fun to travel with him there because you get a lot of attention. And even when I've gone to India and I haven't been with Ami, the first question is usually, how's Ami doing? So it's great to be with y'all. You know, when I first came to Congress, 7.5 years ago, I quickly learned that I had 20 to 30,000 Indian Americans in my constituency, and most of them are all from Gujarat. And they wanted more than anything for India and the United States to have a better relationship. And began working on those issues. This is prior to Modi being elected prime minister. I made my first trip to India during my first year of Congress. And when I came back and started working on trade issues and talking to more senior members who've been around a long time and we're talking about India, they really weren't interested in getting engaged. There have been, I guess, false starts in the past and some difficulties in the relationship. And yeah, it just wasn't a popular issue. And how times have changed. It is a very popular issue now. And members of Congress, many members of Congress are engaged on this. And it's a confluence of circumstance. Prime Minister Modi has done the best that he could to open India to more trade, more foreign direct investment. He's done a good job at tackling some of those transparency issues that Becca was talking about, kind of rule of law, corruption issues, trying to tackle the Byzantine tax system they have between the different states. And he's done a good job at that. And plus, other geopolitical changes, circumstances. The deteriorating relationship between China and the United States has offered a great opportunity for an improving trade relationship and military relationship between the United States and India. I point out to folks who are interested in this that we've come a long way on our military to military relationship. Several years ago in the National Defense Authorization Act, working with Ami, we were able to elevate India's status of a partner there. They don't want to be an ally because they like to remain non-aligned, but they're a very important strategic partner. And indeed, our Pacific Command has been renamed the Indo-Pacific Command. And I was in India, this is a few months before Ami and I were there, and had the fortune of touring one of the naval bases in India and touring some of the ships there, and they're more squared away, just as squared away as our Navy. And they're very proud of our military to military relationship. So there are a lot of factors coming together that I think portend really well for a strengthening relationship with India, both on the trade front and certainly on the military front. And I know a lot of people have questions. I've seen the text box go off a couple of times, although I can't read it because I'm on a phone. But so I look forward to taking questions.
Good. Well, thank you so much. I have one for you and then a couple for the panelists. I'm really glad you mentioned China because it's obviously on the mind of many of us. The US-China relationship has certainly deteriorated. The Indian-Chinese relationship has certainly deteriorated, especially with respect to border issues and even military action, and it's obviously spilling over into other areas as well. The question is whether you think that's going to be enough to overcome some very serious trade barriers that India has, not just with respect to the US, but other countries and markets as well. So whether it's tariffs that are higher than the norm, or whether it's the non-tariff barriers that are keeping out US exports, making it harder for US workers to export product there. How do you see these issues playing out over the next few months and years?
Sure. Well, yeah, in discussions with Indian parliamentarians and ministers, it's been clear that they have had political difficulties in getting rid of some of these trade barriers. There are things that we would like them to do that in the past just have not been politically possible for them. And it's important, it's important for parliamentarians to speak amongst ourselves, just as important as trade representatives to speak, because as parliamentarians, we kind of get the political aspect of it. And whereas a trade representative might be talking, they're talking about science, and they're talking about comparisons to other countries, and they're talking about purely trade issues. A politician can glean from another politician. It's like, hey, we'll lose our seat if we ever approved anything like this. And then you kind of understand what the barrier is. But I do think that the deteriorating situation with China has the potential of changing some of the political logarithms in India, just like they're changing some of the political logarithms here in the United States. So perhaps some of those things that have been politically impossible in the trade arena in India will now become possible because they see the threat, the rising threat and the growing threat of China. So they say, listen, it's time for us to make some conciliations, and we can sell this to our constituents and they'll understand it because China is such a threat and growing threat.
Oh, that's very helpful. I mean, it would be very helpful if it turns out that India could be the kind of partner that helps us also raise labor standards and address environmental challenges, whether it's climate change or other issues. But as we look towards the kinds of agreements that make sense for the US economy, I think those are going to be increasingly important issues. And it's possible with greater political will that India will be able to work with us to address those. Well, you guys have been great in terms of opening up a really fascinating discussion. Before we turn it over to broader Q&A, I wanted to ask each of you to offer some thoughts on what happens if we have President Biden taking office in January versus we have President Trump reelected and taking a second term in January. How do you think either situation will affect the US-India partnership overall, and specifically prospects for a trade agreement that could actually address the barriers that we have seen so far? Any volunteers?
Sure, I'll go ahead and go first. I actually don't see the US-India relationship in a partisan lens, because you've seen both Republican presidents and Democratic presidents, really champion the deal. And when Vice President Biden was vice president, both he and President Obama, talked about the US-India relationship potentially being the defining relationship in the 21st century. And I think that's still on the table, regardless of the outcome of the November election. I think you could see differences, certainly. I think of potential President Biden certainly takes a multilateral approach, whereas President Trump's approach has been more bilateral agreements and negotiations. I do think there's a growing recognition of the direction China is going in. So I don't think that changes too much, because that's somewhat bipartisan in Congress as well. And the concerns about what's happening in Hong Kong, what's happening with the Uyghurs, the saber rattling in the South China Sea, those are all of great interest, not just to the United States and India, but also to all the countries in that region. You know, the importance of maritime freedom and freedom of navigation, maritime security. You see a real strong Quad relationship that we have, and India taking a bigger role with the United States, Japan, Australia, and India all working together on those issues of maritime security. And again, you do see India and Australia growing closer together. So I actually don't think it'll change dramatically based on the outcome of November, because I think Congress will also keep pushing a closeness in the relationship. And then the pandemic, you know, India is going to have a big role in helping us defeat this virus, certainly on the vaccine development side. And I think that presents an opportunity.
Mm-hmm.
So I agree very much with Ami. This is a bipartisan issue, and our constituents who are engaged on this are bipartisan as well. My Indian American constituents are, just as likely to support a Democrat as they are a Republican, as long as we align on issues regarding India. So I don't see a divide here in Congress or at home. I think the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, certainly under a Biden presidency, I think we re-engage on that. And that's a place where we can align with India if we can bring India into the TPP as well. I think India wins either way, quite candidly.
Mm-hmm. Becca, any thoughts to share?
Yeah, I would just agree with what's been said. I don't think I have much to add. That the one thing I think that is very positive right now is I think we're hearing from all the players, free trade agreements, mini agreements. So Juster and Sandhu and Goyle and Ross, everyone is talking very similarly, and that usually is a very positive sign.
Mm-hmm. I want to just quickly follow up on that. If you're the Indian government, are you trying to negotiate something before the November election? Or is the thinking that you might want to wait and see what happens? How do you think these issues are being seen right now in Delhi?
I'll take a crack at it. I think there's a desire to at least get a baby step and something in principle. And if that happens before November, I think the Indians would take that. And so I think it's less, let's wait and see what we get in a Biden administration. Because I don't think it'll be a big trade deal. I think it'll be something smaller, more focused, and that at least keeps the conversation moving forward. I think it'd be hard to get a big trade deal done before November.
So I agree with Ami. It seems like we've been on the cusp of some little mini breakthroughs here. I remember when Ambassador Shringlaw was just leaving the United States a number of months ago for his new posting. We thought we'd have a little mini breakthrough imminent then. So I think things all continue to work apace. I don't sense any standoffishness with the upcoming election.
Good. Well, we've been on the cusp for many years, so it'll be interesting to see if it's different this time, given the political impetus that we've talked about this morning. Good. Well, as a reminder to the audience, please submit questions if you have them via the Q&A function. And let's check in to see what kinds of questions we have so far. Patrick, please feel free to share what you've received already.
Absolutely. So on the trade question, we have one question that, allow me to read it. Is the slow progress in achieving a modest, although first ever trade deal a reflection of the sensitivity of the issues involved? For example, a lack of highest level political commitment, both, or something else? Do our panelists see an opportunity for our two countries to team up on shared interests in the WTO, recognizing that they've historically been at odds on a multilateral basis? And then one further question, how can the US help India as a technology enabler to reduce the carbon footprint of manufacturing sectors?
Both great questions. Let's pose the WTO one first, and then we'll turn to climate change.
Well, I'll say a little thing about the WTO. You know, I have high hopes that we're, you know, right at the point where the WTO is going to get genuine and meaningful reform. I think all parties have come to the conclusion that the system has broken down, and it's not only the appeal process that's broken down. You know, there are other parts of WTO that, you know, don't seem to be functioning correctly, and yeah, India certainly, I think, realizes this, as does the United States, the United Kingdom. And so I do think there's an opportunity for the United States and India to work together there. And you know, to the point about the political commitment, I sense there is political commitment from the highest level in the United States and in India, probably more so than there has been in a generation or more even. There's obvious affinity between the president and the prime minister. And so I think the commitment is there, and putting your finger on exactly what the holdup is on a small advancement forward, I can't really do that, but I don't think it's lack of political will from the highest point.
You know, so if I think about the WTO question, yeah, I agree with George. I'm going to look at it from a slightly different perspective, because I do think the pandemic is the defining issue of our lifetime right now. And, you know, when we think about, you know, the primary impact, the health impact, but really the secondary and tertiary impacts are going to be with us longer than the immediate global health challenge. You know, the economic fallout from this, you know, you're looking at 24, 48 months, the food insecurity issues, you know, the potential instability around the world is, you know, you look at fragile states. But I think the silver lining here is, you know, this is a World War II type of event where, you know, coming out of World War II, we were able to build global alliances and institutions that reflected the post-war world, and really did serve us well in the 20th century and the 75 years post-World War II. I think this is that type of event where we should actually take this opportunity to think about what kind of multilateral global organizations and institutions do we need for the 21st century to address 21st century challenges like climate change, like massive food insecurity, massive displacement of people around the world. And, you know, the politics won't be easy. You know, we've been trying forever to modernize the United Nations and give permanent membership in the Security Council to be more reflective of today and not 1945. But I think it's possible. On the trade front, you know, trade negotiations are always difficult. I mean, there are issues that our companies have, you know, within India in the regulatory environment, price controls, intellectual property issues, and so forth. But those are issues that we can, you know, certainly work through. Again, not easy to do, but I think possible and in both our interests. So I think that, you know, we can get to that if there's a commitment.
Mm-hmm. Good, thank you. Becca, any thoughts to share?
If I could just jump in, I also would just add that I hope people don't feel discouraged between the relationship by not having a grand agreement or a grand announcement, because as we mentioned before, I think there's a lot of work going on and there's a lot of effective agreements. For example, the forum has a number of working groups: defense, synergy, connectivity. In the last few months, there have been discussions at US ISPF through the forum with Ambassador Jester, Ambassador Sandhu, Secretary Ross, Minister Gould. They're going on continuously. And I just want to give one little vignette on what I know well, which is connectivity. So one of the things that the COVID crisis has emphasized is the importance of connectivity, but also those who don't have it. And how do we overcome that problem? And that's both in the US and India. And so an example of a best practice in India that we're looking at for the United States is at the bottom of the towers, the the tower can often be not only the first broadband connection, but the first electricity. So in India, we have what we call digital villages at the bottom of that tower, where we've put in healthcare, we put in educational centers, and now HPE is putting in healthcare centers, et cetera. And we're looking at doing some similar things in the United States. So those things are going on continuously. So I just want to make people, or let people know that the relationship is continuing. And I think both our embassies are very engaged, and all the companies are engaged, and the trade negotiators are engaged.
Good. Over to Patrick. Other questions we can address?
Of course, yes. We have one question about the importance of education within the US-India relationship. About 10% of the trade volume between the two countries is in higher education, approximately 12 billion, according to some statistics. Yet education is almost never part of an official trade, of the official trade discussions between the two countries. Are we missing the opportunity here to factor in education within a larger trade agreement?
So I'll take a crack at that. Education, when it comes to U.S.-India, often falls under immigration because of the large number of Indian students that are coming to the United States, my parents included, to get their college education, and many of them staying here. And I think that's certainly served the United States very well. If you look at the CEO of Google, Microsoft, et cetera, folks that came here on an H-1B. I think in the context of trade, though, and mutual investment, the United States continues to have the premier academic research institutions and the premier R&D in the world. And that's an area where India has the potential. And if our academic institutions could work with Indian academic institutions, they've got the raw talent, the intellectual resources there. They just don't quite have the mature academic research institutes. Certainly you see it in some of the technology sectors in India, but there's huge potential there. And I think that's where you potentially could get our research universities partnering with Indian research institutions to help grow and develop that capacity, not just to solve the problems in the United States and India, but also India has the unique capability of helping us solve issues in the developing world. And that could be a unique partnership.
So just to tag in what Ami's saying, there have been instances of trade agreements that do tackle immigration issues. I'm thinking just off the top of my head, the agreement we had with Australia, included an extra portion of high-skilled visas in that agreement. And, we run into some complications here in Congress because immigration is the province of the Judiciary Committee. So I recall when we were doing the Korea agreement, there were additional visas included in that agreement, and then the Judiciary Committee objected, and they were taken out. So it is something that we can put into a trade agreement, and I think it would be certainly fitting to do so with India. And then, the partnership on education. I think one thing that'll come out of this COVID pandemic is more facility and more willingness to work online, kind of like what we're doing right now. And India could be a great partner, not only in research but in medicine, video, telemedicine. Lots of good things to come out from there. And of course, Becca can tag onto this with connectivity because they're right there in the catbird seat to kind of make it all come to fruition because of the increased connectivity that you have in India through American Tower and their venture with Tata. So,
well, Congressman Holdings, being a little diplomatic, when I was at USTR, various members of Congress made it very clear that immigration was immigration and trade was trade. So those issues have been addressed in prior agreements to some extent with other countries, but I think it's been a challenge to try and do that in a trade agreement. But I don't think it means that the educational exchanges and the services that those exchanges entail aren't very much top of mind as government officials look towards what they can do to expand our partnership. Patrick, other questions we can address? If not, I can pose some. Go ahead.
Building off of the idea of connectivity and touching on the relationship with China that we discussed earlier, India last month just banned a number of Chinese-owned apps such as TikTok and WeChat. France has followed suit. Do we think that the US should fall into that same pattern given the rising threat of China and continuous violation of rules in the global system? How would that change the state of connectivity?
Becca, do you want to address that?
Actually, on the connectivity side, on the Huawei situation and China situation, which I think is being referenced here, that is really outside of my wheelhouse. So I wouldn't address that directly. I think that connectivity globally is critical. And it is, I think the Indian government sees and understands that. And I think they're taking it into the larger context.
So I'll say
George?
Well, with India, with the banning of Huawei or WeChat or TikTok, I think the Indians know, and we are learning, and other places are learning that the Chinese Communist Party is a part of everything that China does worldwide, and you have to assess the threat level of something coming from China through that lens. And I think that's what India has done, and I think that's what the United States ought to do as well.
And if I just play off of George, I think both Becca and George hit the nail on the head. I mean, most of us want the free flow of information and a more interconnected world. We think that helps us solve the world's problems. But the challenge with China, and we see it in Hong Kong, we see it elsewhere, is control of information also allows you to exert a certain amount of control as well. And I think that's the real concern with China, that control and security of that movement of information. And in democratic countries like the United States and India, where we do believe in free markets and free competition to some extent, I think that is a legitimate concern and something that we certainly in Congress have a concern about, and the Indians probably increasingly have that same concern.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Patrick, we probably have time for one more question, maybe two, depending on how long the responses are.
Of course. So one question from one of our listeners: what political and economic issues might place the greatest stress on bipartisan support for US-India ties?
I'll let Amit take that one. I can't think of anything right off the top of my head.
I think there's strong bipartisan support for the economic and the defense-to-defense relationship, recognizing it's in our mutual interest to see that grow. Certainly, if there are stresses, India's unique character as a secular nation where you can have 750 million Hindus living side by side with 250 million Muslims. I think if that secular nature of India that makes it such a unique country was threatened, that certainly could pose some threats to the strong bipartisan support. And again, I think that would be one issue that potentially would threaten that support.
I would just jump in, Ambassador, and say I don't know if it's not partisan or bipartisan in my way of thinking, but COVID is presenting a huge challenge in that it's only natural, I think, for people to think just about not only just nationally but locally, And I think that forums like this keep the dialogue going, and that's very, very important. As I mentioned early on, I had a little bird's eye view into what could happen with medications flowing between countries if that flow did not continue to happen. So I think we're living through a time where it would be very easy to just think locally. And I think dialogues like this are really critical, and members of Congress keeping open to global dialogues is very important.
That's a great point. And I know there may be a few more questions, and what I would encourage Patrick to do is to send them around to us, and if we can respond offline, I think each of us would be happy to do that. I want to be respectful of people's times and try to close at least close to our finish time, which is right about now. I really want to thank each of our panelists. They've just been extraordinary to share their thoughts and their perspective, and most importantly, their time with us today. And I think we've given a great overview of what is really the tremendous potential in this relationship. And I think that's been the view for a long time in a bipartisan way. But at the same time, as the panel pointed out, we have some tremendous opportunities, especially now, with respect to working together to address the challenge of COVID-19, to think more concretely about climate change and what we might be able to do together, to address the next billion people who are wanting and trying to get online, the connectivity issues, and trade and investment can play a part. It's certainly not the solution, but there is a role that can play. At the same time, we have to be mindful of some of the very serious challenges we've faced in the past, which are not going to disappear, whether it's trying to raise labor standards or address price controls or IP issues. We're going to have to find ways to tackle those. And maybe we can overcome some of those before November 3rd, but I would venture to guess that most of them will be around for a bit longer. And so I think continuing the dialogue as we've done today is really critical. Keeping the questions coming and being creative about how we can address some of these barriers going forward will also be crucial. So again, I want to thank the audience for tuning in this morning, this evening, wherever you may be, and really a special thank you to each and every one of our panelists for their time today.